Hello and welcome to a thought experiment that will hopefully never ever happen in reality. We are diving headfirst into a pool of what ifs so chilling it might make your chopsticks shiver. We're talking about a scenario where China, with all its ambitions and military might, decides to just swallow South Asia whole. Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan gone, absorbed into the Red Dragon. Now, before you start converting your rupees to renminbi, let's be clear, this is all hypothetical, but sometimes it's by peering into the abyss of the improbable that we gain a better understanding of the world we actually live in. We're talking about a land grab of unprecedented scale, potentially displacing billions of people and redrawing the geopolitical map as we know it. Think of the chaos, the humanitarian crisis, the sheer logistical nightmare of trying to control a region as diverse and populous as South Asia. Before we start drawing up surrender flags, let's break down exactly what a Chinese conquest of South Asia would mean. So buckle up, grab your thinking caps, and let's dive into the dragon's den.
All right, let's start by addressing the elephant in the room, or should I say, the dragon in the Himalayas. China extending its reach across South Asia would be like swapping out your grandma's china cabinet for a roaring bonfire, messy, destructive, and impossible to ignore. On the global chessboard, this move would make even Bobby Fischer spit out his chewing gum in disbelief. First off, regional domination wouldn't even begin to cover it. We're talking about China controlling a region with over 2 billion people, a treasure trove of resources, and some of the world's busiest shipping lanes. It'd be like China winning the geopolitical lottery, but with a much higher risk of global condemnation. Because let's not forget, the world's other superpowers wouldn't just be sitting around sipping tea and watching this unfold. The US, the EU, even Russia, they'd be scrambling to respond, and the potential for escalation into, shall we say, a misunderstanding involving some strongly worded diplomatic notes and maybe a few misguided missiles is terrifyingly high. But it's not just the big players we need to worry about. China's actions would embolden other expansionist nations, whispering, well, if China can do it. And suddenly, the world starts to look a lot like a risk board after a particularly aggressive game of beer pong. The UN, the WTO, these organizations rely on a certain level of, not actively conquering your neighbors to function. A move like this could shatter the fragile peace we've cobbled together, leaving us with a world where might makes right and international law goes the way of the dodo. The geopolitical ripple effects of such a move are almost impossible to overstate.
Now, some of you might be thinking, John, you delightful scamp, you're being a tad dramatic. Surely China conquering South Asia wouldn't be that easy. And to that, I say you're absolutely right. It wouldn't be easy. It would be a logistical and military nightmare. Imagine trying to herd cats, but the cats are heavily armed, incredibly nationalistic, and have a deep-seated aversion to being herded by anyone, let alone a dragon. First off, let's not forget that both India and Pakistan have armies that could give even the People's Liberation Army a run for their money. We're talking millions of soldiers, tanks that could crush a small car, and probably have, and enough firepower to make a Michael Bay film look like a Quaker meeting. And while China might have the edge in terms of technology and sheer numbers, fighting a war across the Himalayas and the plains of India is a whole different ballgame than, say, a military parade in Tiananmen Square. Then there's the small matter of nuclear weapons. Both India and Pakistan have them, and while no one in their right mind wants to see a nuclear winter, the potential for escalation in a conflict of this scale is about as comforting as a hug from a radioactive bear. But even if by some miracle China managed to overcome these military hurdles, they'd then face the unenviable task of occupying a region larger than Europe, with a population that makes the entire Western Hemisphere look like a sparsely populated suburb. Imagine the troops needed, the resources required, the sheer logistical impossibility of trying to control a population that doesn't want to be controlled. The truth is, a military conquest of South Asia would be a Pyrrhic victory at best for China. Even if they managed to pull it off, the cost in terms of lives lost, resources drained, and international condemnation would be astronomical.
Now let's talk about everyone's favorite topic, money. Or, more accurately, the soul-crushing lack of it that would follow a Chinese conquest of South Asia. Because here's the thing about war, folks, it's really, really bad for business. Imagine, if you will, the global economy as a delicate ecosystem. Now picture China, in all its dragon-shaped glory, deciding to play Godzilla with that ecosystem. We're talking about supply chains severed, markets crashing, and investors jumping out of windows with the enthusiasm of lemmings on a cliff. See, South Asia isn't just a land of vibrant cultures and delicious curries, it's also a major player in the global economy. India alone is one of the world's fastest-growing economies, and disrupting that growth would send shockwaves across the planet. We're talking about a global recession that would make the 2008 financial crisis look like a minor dip in the stock market. But it's not just the rest of the world that would suffer. China's economy, already facing its own set of challenges, would be stretched thinner than a yoga instructor on a juice cleanse. The cost of the war, the burden of occupying and controlling such a vast region, and the inevitable sanctions from the international community would cripple the Chinese economy, potentially leading to internal unrest and instability. So, while China might dream of controlling the economic engine of South Asia, the reality is that such a move would likely backfire spectacularly.
Now, we've talked about the geopolitical chaos, the military quagmire, and the economic meltdown. But let's be clear. The most devastating consequence of a Chinese conquest of South Asia would be the human cost. We're talking about a humanitarian crisis of unimaginable scale, a tragedy that would make the Syrian civil war look like a minor disagreement over a parking space. Imagine, if you will, millions, perhaps even billions of people displaced from their homes, families torn apart, refugees fleeing across borders, crammed into overcrowded camps with little food, water, or hope. The images we've seen from places like Syria and Yemen would pale in comparison to the sheer scale of human suffering unleashed by such a conflict. And it's not just the immediate impact of war that we need to consider. The cultural and religious tensions in South Asia are already a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Imagine the Chinese government, with its history of suppressing religious and ethnic minorities, trying to impose its will on a region as diverse and complex as South Asia. It'd be like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, except the peg is a totalitarian regime and the hole is a billion people with a long and storied history of resistance. We'd be talking about a cultural genocide, a systematic attempt to erase the identities of entire communities. Languages suppressed, religions persecuted, traditions outlawed, all in the name of creating a homogeneous, easily controlled population. And let's not forget about the inevitable resistance. The people of South Asia have a long and proud history of fighting for their freedom. A Chinese occupation would be met with fierce resistance, leading to a brutal cycle of violence and repression.
Now, let's say, for the sake of argument, that China somehow managed to overcome all of these obstacles. They've conquered South Asia, crushed all resistance, and are now sitting pretty on top of their newly acquired pile of land and people. What happens next? Well, folks, that's when things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean utterly terrifying. First off, we'd likely see a systematic attempt to Sinicize South Asia. We're talking about Mandarin being pushed as the official language, Chinese history being taught in schools, and a gradual erosion of local cultures and traditions. Imagine a world where Bollywood is replaced with propaganda films extolling the virtues of the Communist Party, where ancient temples are replaced with monuments to Chairman Xi, where the vibrant tapestry of South Asian culture is slowly bleached away. On the global stage, we'd see the emergence of new alliances and power blocs. The US, Europe, and other democratic nations would likely form a united front against China, leading to a new Cold War, only this time the stakes would be even higher. We're talking about a world divided, with two superpowers vying for dominance, each armed with enough nuclear weapons to turn the planet into a radioactive wasteland. And let's not forget about the potential for conflict. A Chinese-controlled South Asia would be a powder keg just waiting to explode. The long-term consequences of a Chinese conquest of South Asia are almost too vast to comprehend.
So there you have it, a glimpse into the abyss, a taste of the nightmare that would be a Chinese conquest of South Asia. It's a scenario that should send chills down the spine of every rational person, a stark reminder of the fragility of peace and the importance of international cooperation. Conquering South Asia would be like trying to swallow a porcupine sideways for China, painful, messy, and ultimately self-defeating. The resistance they would face, both from within the region and from global powers, would make governing impossible. It's a gamble no sane leader would take, and the consequences would be too dire to imagine. But this thought experiment isn't just about scaring the living daylights out of you, though I'll admit a little bit of existential dread never hurt anyone. It's about understanding the stakes, the delicate balance of power that keeps our world from descending into chaos. So the next time you hear someone downplaying China's ambitions or dismissing the importance of international institutions, remind them of this. Sometimes the best way to prevent a nightmare is to stare it straight in the face.